So what you're looking at now is the guide that I've put together based on PioSolver outputs, generating the optimal statistics, at least based on the settings that I've used, the optimal statistics for a heads up no limit player. So a lot of the stats are the same. Some of them are a little bit different. I'm not going to walk through every single stat right now, but I just want to explain quickly. So this is a document that I share with my students. The top row is the old version that I just kind of created on feel. So it's actually kind of fun now in hindsight to look at the feel version of the stats that I used to recommend compared to the PioSolver outputs that I now recommend. You can see here that these were created just for this course. And the interesting thing that we can do once we have all of these stats, I'll just show like how far down this goes. So there's quite a number of new stats that I added here. The old report was based on exactly what I showed you at the beginning, the database report that I had in Poker Tracker. So for that reason, I was even recommending when to showdown, one soft flop. These are still kind of, let's call it a educated guess from my point of view, because PioSolver can't tell me, or at least I haven't really thought about how to calculate based on PioSolver outputs, what these stats should look like. So this is just a summary of what I was recommending based on experience, based on what I was seeing in other players' reports. And I'm frequently changing these. I actually haven't updated this top row in a while, but I'm frequently changing these based on what I'm noticing is changing in the average winning player in the games. So, and this continues. I've got some very specific stats on how to play all these spots. And the reason I did this is because the goal for me is to compare the way that I'm playing, or for you to compare the way that you're playing to these benchmarks, and then to identify the gaps and figure out what it is that you want to focus on improving. So, of course, there's a lot of different areas that we can improve. So I'm going to go back over to Poker Tracker, and I'm going to copy my Legend Showdown stats into this report. And then we're going to walk through a comparison together on what I would focus on and what I would not focus on. Just to show you quickly the process, I'm back here in Poker Tracker at the Report tab. And from here, I can right-click, Export Report, and I can save the file with all of these stats included. And I'm going to take these numbers from that Excel file and copy them into the document I showed before. Okay, now we're back at the overall report here. So you can see there's some stats that copied in that are not the same as what I have in this report. So I'll just try to delete those as we go. But the original guidelines are going to be here on the second row, and then my Legend Showdown statistics are going to be here in the third row. So this first group of stats, like I suggested at the beginning or in the introduction to this section, this first group of stats are going to be relatively easy to just compare to preflop charts or preflop solutions. So a few things that I'm noticing, just getting this over here. So now we've got all of the preflop statistics in one place. First in percentages, I'm not expecting to be too weird, but I am noticing that my 3-bet percentage was a little bit low. So PFR from the big blind and 3-bet preflop going to be the same exact statistic. So being at 20 instead of 24, in my opinion, is it a huge problem? Not really. Is it a potential problem? Yeah. So what I do as I go through these is I would just mark this as low. So I use blue for, it's kind of like cold and hot. So I use it for low aggression and for high folding. And then I would use red for high aggression and low folding. So this is going to be something to come back to later on. Same with this fold to 3-bet being 64 instead of 58. Maybe something worth paying attention to, right? So I'm going to mark that blue as well. The fold to 4-bet, way too small of a sample to know. The 4-bet preflop may be relevant. So 4-bet preflop only at 5.5. My data shows that it should be 8%. So these all, when you're working with small samples, having 3 cold tags in the same area, so having 3 different indicators that you're playing preflop a little bit too weak, a little bit too passively, it maybe makes it more likely in my mind that there's something here. So this to me is worth coming back to as a point of review. Okay, so continuing on to the first few post-flop statistics, we've got c-betting, flop, turn, and river, and we've got check raising, or in this case have generalized it to raising flop, turn, and river. So the reminder here is that because we're playing heads up no limit, you know that the small blind, when c-betting, is mostly playing single raise pots, although there are some 4-bet pots mixed in here, and if you wanted to filter those out, you certainly could. But this is going to be overwhelmingly single raise pots, and I think that's going to drive the averages pretty much to that exact number. And these numbers here, for what it's worth, quite literally assume that we are playing a single raised pot. So this is not an average of single raised pots and 4-bet pots. This is just single raised pot, c-bet, flop, turn, river. And then for big blind, it's 3-bet pot, flop, turn, river. Same thing for check raising. This assumes single raised pot out of position. How often are we check raising? The optimal statistics here, that's what they assume. But of course, the overall big blind statistic, this will include some 3-bet pots where you decide to check the flop. Again, this is going to be much less frequent, so it's not going to move the data that much. But if you did want the perfect comparison, you should filter that out. So when comparing single raised pot, c-bet, flop, turn, river here, over this sample, I would say the only noteworthy thing to tag is that my flop c-bet is low. And then for 3-bet pot, flop, turn, river, I would say the most relevant thing to tag is that my turn c-bet is low. These river c-bets are a little bit off, but again, we're working with such small samples. I'm guessing this is 4 out of 9, and this is 5 out of 9 or something like that. C-bet river doesn't come up that much. So I'm okay with ignoring these for now. I would look more closely on a more detailed pass or over a larger sample. Then looking at the raise statistics, we're comparing to here. I would say check raise flop is low to a noteworthy degree. Check raise turn looks fine. And check raise river, I didn't actually put a stat here in the guidelines. And I tag this so that I would remember to bring up a pretty important point. When I'm extracting this data from aggregate reports, I have to make some assumptions about what bet sizes happened on earlier streets. And I think this becomes a little problematic when we start looking at river c-bet or facing river c-bet especially, because I'm compounding these assumptions about what sizes were taken early on. Now, what I did with a lot of these stats and what I could do is I've averaged the optimal percentage of river c-betting, for example, after quarter pot on the flop, overbet turn, average that with quarter pot on the flop, 2/3 on the turn, and also average that with 3/4 on the flop, 2/3 on the turn, 3/4 on the flop, overbet on the turn. But I think you see what I mean now, that there's a lot of different ways you could be facing a river c-bet. You could be facing a river c-bet after 2 small bets, a small and a big bet, 2 big bets, and the size of the river c-bet is different as well. So averaging all of that together, first of all, is a lot of work because you need to run a separate report for every sizing sequence. And then you need to figure out how frequently all those different sizing sequences happen, average them together like a weighted average, all of those together, and then you get one number. So this is how you end up with stuff like 27% raise river c-bet in 3-bet pot. I don't think this is a particularly useful guideline, because all it's telling you is, with the sizings I suggested, whenever you're facing a river c-bet, you're very often facing a river c-bet at a really, really low stack to pot ratio. The amount left to put into the pot is somewhat insignificant. and therefore the raising frequency is going to look pretty high. This is 120 big blinds deep, 3-bet pot. We called flop, we called turn. There's not going to be that much money left. So if we're raising a river c-bet, it's probably because they block bet. And if they block bet, our raising frequency should be quite high. So take these numbers, especially the ones that I've tagged in blue, with a grain of salt. And just wanted to explain the sequence of assumptions that goes into coming up with a quote unquote optimal guideline. Okay, so moving on to fold versus check raise. These stats are reasonably important, especially on early streets, but kind of for different reasons. So for flop, I'm going to point this out because this is a high fold to flop check raise, so definitely getting tagged. It's also relevant because my flop c-bet was low in the first place. So this is the point in the review where I try to start making connections that reflect on overall strategy to figure out what part of my process is leading to these mistakes. So something in combination that could create a low flop c-bet and a high fold to flop check raise is a c-betting range that's comprised of too much pure air and not enough equity. So this is something that I want to consider when I'm looking at the other stats. For example, if I peek ahead and look at my fold to turn probe over my sample is not crazy high. It seems like a pretty well protected number. So this supports the idea that I'm checking a pretty strong range and I'm c-betting perhaps too polarized of a range, a little bit too weak of a range. I'm not exactly sure what it is, right? But all signs are pointing towards not c-betting flop with enough equity and c-betting flop with too much trash. And then I can later go into my database, review some hands in that spot and see if that's accurate. Because once I figure that out, I have a much easier time correcting my mistake. Fold to turn check raise is going to be a similar story. So here my fold to turn check raise is too low. And if I look back at my turn c-bet, it's also relatively low. I mean, considering that my flop c-bet was low and then the turn continues to be low, this range is probably a little bit too strong. And then my c-bet river is too high, so that supports the idea that I'm just too strong c-betting the turn. Usually what fold to turn check raise being low means is that my turn range doesn't have enough bluffs. So now I'm, reconsidering that whole thing. Okay, too much low equity on the flop, not enough bluffs on the turn. Does that mean I'm c-betting a lot of one and done bluffs, like pure trash that don't look like they turn equity enough, and therefore I'm not barreling turn with enough bluffs? This could all fit together, right? I'm trying to paint a picture for what strategically is happening that I'm not consciously correcting, and I'm bringing some consciousness to those mistakes.